Merci beaucoup, Madame la...
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I will tell you the history of a couple from Hearst, Ontario, who own Road Distillery. They produce Loon vodka, and they're really in a place where they can't increase their prices to be competitive. And an increase in the tax of 6% is really something that will hurt them and their product, which has won many medals for quality, the quality of the product. So it's really for people like Marcel and Mireille that we need to pass this motion tonight.
To rise and to talk a little bit about the situation in Winnipeg, where we have a lot of local brewers and distillers in the province of Manitoba. I think especially of Crown Royal, but there's many beer makers in Manitoba. Half Pints, Barnhammer, Torque, Little Brown Jug, I could go on. There are a number, and you know, Manitobans are pleased to support their local brewers when they reach to the fridge for a beer after the end of a long week, if that's their choice, Mr. Speaker. We want them to be able to continue to do that and to be able to continue to support local economies when they do that. But the fact of the matter is that many producers, particularly smaller producers, are in a tight spot when it comes to an increase on the excise tax. The excise tax isn't based on a percentage of their revenue or of their profit. It's a certain amount that they have to pay for every unit sold. And so when it goes up, it really has an impact on their business model. And we're seeing, because that raise in the rate of tax is tied to inflation, we're seeing that being a particularly high increase this year. I think that was always the problem with having a tax that was tied to inflation, like a tax levied at an absolute rate that's raised at the rate of inflation. That was something that was raised in 2017, 2018, when the Liberals first brought this in as being a problem. People said, well, what if we have a period of extraordinary inflation? And they said, well, that's not likely to happen. Inflation's been very consistent. But of course we know that major events can change the course of an economy, and Canada, along with many other parts of the world, has certainly been experiencing that. We've had a major event in the pandemic. There were major events happening as a result of climate change. Those are having impacts on the economy, and as we see inflation go up, we shouldn't see the government exacerbating those problems of inflation by having an automatic increase in the tax, which isn't to say that no taxes can increase, but it is appropriate to have a debate and a vote in Parliament in order to have that happen. And what we're seeing now is the fruit of a decision to take Parliament out of the equation and to have those taxes increase automatically at the rate of inflation, instead of increasing deliberately by a choice of Parliament in the face of difficult economic circumstances. As my colleague from South Okanagan, Kootenay Valley pointed out quite rightly before, there are other issues in the excise tax, and the Democrats support the idea of a more gradual ramping up of the excise tax in order to help smaller brewers and smaller producers be more competitive when they're trying to carve out a space for themselves in what is a very competitive market with a lot of established large players. That's not exactly what the motion calls for tonight, but I think that's part of the larger conversation that we might be able to have more readily in this place if the excise tax wasn't already on an automatic escalator, because it would mean that government would have to come back to this place every year if they wanted to see the excise tax go up. And that would create opportunities for parliamentarians like New Democrats who are interested in a fairer excise tax structure for smaller producers to raise those issues at that time. So today we're doing this in the context of an opposition day motion, because actually otherwise there's no natural opportunity to be able to discuss this kind of thing. So I do think that there's a real argument to be made about the particular economic circumstances we find ourselves in, both for Canadians who enjoy the odd beer, who are already facing increasing costs on groceries, rent, and everything else, who don't need an added increase on the excise tax to their beer. There's an argument to be made for small businesses that are going to be distressed by having to pay these additional costs and worrying about whether or not they can raise their price in order to pass that on to the consumer without just getting shut out of the market. But I also think there's a more general and principled argument about the role of Parliament in approving taxation, and where we can have great debates about what the appropriate rate of taxation is in this place on various things, and I'm sure you'll find at least as much disagreement as you find agreement on that. I think it's important that debate come to this place and then increases in taxes are approved. I would say that this is just the other side of the coin of another measure that I don't personally support, which is indexing income tax brackets to inflation too, because I think that governments and legislatures particularly have a responsibility to evaluate the circumstances and make decisions in a particular time about what's appropriate. So if that's a change in tax brackets, that's something that should be deliberately debated, and that a very intentional decision should be made about. When it comes to something like the excise tax, likewise, that's something that should be debated and there should be an intentional decision about. I think this mechanism of an automatic escalator is problematic because it removes people's democratically elected legislators from the equation when we're having important debates about what an appropriate rate of taxation is. But certainly, I'm a member of the Finance Committee. I was very happy to see in the Finance Committee's pre-budget consultation report a recommendation to freeze this planned excise tax increase. So that lets you know it's not just coming from one party. It takes a majority voice on a committee in order to issue a recommendation. And I think the government should take very seriously the fact that coming out of one of the House of Commons' most senior committees was a recommendation not to proceed with this tax hike. And I think they need to look at the extent to which the excise tax will be increased because of the extraordinary period of inflation that we've been living over the 12 months. The last 12 months. This wasn't the kind of usual inflation that was normal in the Canadian economy prior to the pandemic. I don't believe this is what the government of the day foresaw. It's certainly not what Canadians foresaw when this automatic escalator was put in, and I think it's reasonable to recognize that the situation calls for a different course of action. So that's why I'm pleased to rise in support of the motion alongside my other New Democratic colleagues, and I thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Souris Moose Mountain.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the member for Elmwood-Transcona for his speech, and it's great to hear that he's going to support our Opposition Day motion. It's interesting, we've heard from this government that they continually talk about their comeback on this is this escalating tax is 1 cent on a beer. If it's 1 cent on a beer that they downplay that so much, why is it we even bother putting the 1 cent on a beer then? Why aren't we giving Canadians that break? The unfortunate part is Canadians have lost that trust in this government. And what we need to do is start building that trust back in Canadians. And one of the steps to do it, and one of the first steps, is to show them that they have confidence. And I appreciate the member's comments, and I wonder if he would like to further on that aspect.
The Honourable Member for Elmwood-Transcona.
Well, thank you very much for the question. I have to say, Mr. Speaker, I feel remiss if I didn't take a moment just to acknowledge what's happened in the House here with the member for Don Valley North. Obviously, I'm not in a position to speak to the veracity of the claims that have been made in the media, but I think this is an important reminder of the very real personal and professional impacts that the debate we've been having around foreign interference in elections can have. I think it's an example of why it's important that we have a public inquiry so that there can be a proper airing of the kinds of accusations that are being made in the media, in many cases now by anonymous sources, so that folks in the Chinese Canadian community have the opportunity to know that those claims are being considered by someone who has access to the full evidence and has the power to clear names where names should be cleared. And I think that that's really why it is important that we have nothing short of a public inquiry. Now, on the question that I was posed, I mean, I think it's a good point that, well, it's a relatively small increase in some ways, that argument doesn't really pass muster, because it is a big impact on the bottom lines of these smaller producers of beer and spirits and wines. But at the end of the day, like, if it's not that big of an increase, if that's what the government is saying, well, then it's not that big a loss for them to bypass it. We know that other government revenue has grown a fair bit because of inflation. This is not the place to do it. And if the government wants other revenue, we know there are companies like Loblaws, frankly, that can afford to pay more in tax. Government should be looking at them, not smaller producers of beer, spirits, and wine, in order to raise revenue.
Questions and comments? Question commentaire, the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I was eager to get up and ask my colleague from Elmwood Transcona a question about a balance on taxation of products that lead to certain health outcomes. And I was actually eager to stand up and say, hey, it was kind of you to acknowledge the pain that our colleague was going through, but then my colleague kind of politicized a little bit, and I was pretty disappointed, actually. I'm a bit shaken because, of what these types of debates do to people and families in this place, and I think that's exactly why a nonpartisan person should be the one to determine whether or not there's a judicial inquiry in this case, and I hope we can let that stand and allow that person to do the work. Going back to beer and excise tax, Mr. Speaker, comes down to a balance on precisely how we tax these products to ensure that they're providing a commensurate revenue for healthcare in this country. So I'm a big fan of products that he mentioned, and a big fan of the two breweries and the winery in my riding. So where does that balance sit? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I'll just provide a little bit of a caution here to make sure that we stick to the debate that we're having tonight. The Honourable Member for Elmwood Transcona.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I already said my piece on the other matter. So in respect of his question on the motion that we're dealing with this evening, what I would say is that there definitely is a debate to be had about that proper balance. My point is that an automatic escalator makes it harder to have that debate, and it doesn't cause a debate to be had of necessity when those taxes go up. So let's have those debates. Let's make those decisions here on the floor of Parliament. An automatic escalator actually deviates from that very path and from having that debate about the right balance in this place.
Questions and comments? Question commentaire, one last one. L'honneur de député de Pointe-la-Pointe de Lille.
Merci.
Thank you. I'd like to abstain from commenting on the need of an independent public inquiry on other matters, but I would like to hear, in a context where the federal government has significant budget surpluses, but there is inflation, why does the Liberal government want to increase this tax by 6.3%? I wouldn't say that we are in a surplus situation in the federal budget. I feel that there will be deficits on the way, but this increase of over 6% has come because there is an automatic escalator mechanism to increase that tax. And in my opinion, that is wrong. As parliamentarians, we should have a debate and make intentional decisions with regards to tax increases. And in the current context, we are in an extreme inflationary period as compared to previous decades. I don't believe that this is the time to have an exceptional increase in excise taxes on these products.